University of London, and Jamie Unwin, Head of Digital Technology at the Science Museum Group. And the session will be chaired by Alistair Hardaker, the Museum and Heritage Advisors Editor. Over to you.
Thank you, guys. Can everyone hear me? Yep, great stuff. So just a bit of housekeeping to begin with. I'm going to go through this as a conversation of sorts. I won't be doing lots of talking, partly because I have a frog in my throat, but also because these guys are the ones who know what we're talking about today. If we have any time at the end, I will put some Q&As opportunities out there, but other than that, we'll get started. Before I do, I just want to see, just as a show of hands, really, who's here because they're skeptical or concerned about AI and artificial intelligence? Anybody worried? Is that one, two? Here we go. All right, some more. About a third. Good. Well, that's interesting. That'll colour the debate today. So it's a session. It's a primer session. So we're going to start by setting out the current state of AI in museums. So I'll come to you first, Oonagh, because you also set up helped set up the Museums and AI Network. Should we start by helping us sort of define what we mean, because it's quite an amorphous technology. Sometimes people think of the cloud, they think of giant computers. What are we actually talking about today?
Yeah, so I think AI is currently being used as a catch-all for a really wide variety of different mechanisms of data processing. And I think you can get into the granularity of what those technologies are, and I might pass some of that on to you. But I think as a foundational point, let's start with the idea that AI is a mechanism of processing data. And I think that's a really good way to start thinking about this technology. So moving beyond this idea that they're magic and they're unknowable, actually, they're an advanced form of data processing.
Okay, great. Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I think... Oonagh sort of said it. Yeah, I think to me, I would say the same thing, really. This is, you need to look at these as these are algorithms, these are processes for processing data. They're not something magical from the show of hands. It looks like that's changed. I think 5 years ago, if you put that, you would have had a hell of a lot more hands up and you've gone, this is really scary. Yeah. And now we're seeing it in our emails and we're seeing it, and it's not taken. And I think Oonagh can talk about this as well, that there are things we should be concerned about and how we're using it, but it's not as a technology itself. It's kind of how we're using it and where we're using it.
I think for anyone who's here who doesn't really understand that definition very well, I mean, it's in more places than we might first realize anyway. It's kind of here anyway. Is it the distinction I'd like to make today is between the stuff that's there anyway, like voice assistants, and the more advanced sort of technology. Do you think there's a good distinction to be drawn between those two? Because I'm sure no one's concerned about the adoption of Siri in the workplace, but they might be about someone ingesting all of their data.
Yeah, exactly. I would say the thing that you're worried about, don't worry about it. Museums probably don't have the money to do it or worry about it. I would say the things that you're ignoring and think aren't problematic are the things that you should be worried about. So AI has already been used widely in society, and it's already been used widely in museums. So whether that's helping you to write an email, using ChatGPT to help you reformulate a report so it sounds better, whether it's using images in a PowerPoint presentation that have been generated by AI. For museums, I would encourage you to think about the foundational uses, the everyday operational uses, before you're starting to think about the wider implications of what AI is. And there's a bit of a scale to this. If you're the Science Museum Group, you're probably a lot more advanced in terms of the scale of projects that you're working on, and the conversations that you're having are quite different. If you're here from a small regional museum or an independent institution, then actually that operational use of AI is probably where you should be looking first and not being distracted by the promise of the tech bros.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's another distinction in some ways. Are you relying 100% AI? Are you just turning blindly and saying, let the AI catalog stuff? And I don't think anyone would suggest you do that. And there's risk there. On the other hand, you can have an AI built into maybe your collection system that says, you've written an article on someone, do you think this is who it is? Yes or no? And that may help you link that record up with other information around the web and to other museums. So there's a benefit there of kind of, I suppose, in the same way as your email is suggesting, it's sort of saying, I've done the work of giving you suggestions. At this point, can you make a distinction? So it's done some heavy lifting. I think there's a distinction between sort of blindly letting systems just go and do their thing, and using it to sort of aid a human.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like when we look at the application of AI, there is that real distinction, I think, between human augmentation, so helping you to do your stuff better. So if you're getting ChatGPT to write a report based on a prompt, that would be semi-autonomous. If you're inputting your own words into ChatGPT, that's a form of human augmentation. So it's using your own words as data, processing that based on what it knows about language structure, and creating a better output. And so I think that clarity and that distinction between autonomous working or semi-autonomous working and processing of data versus human augmentation. So essentially when systems are working with you, but you as a human have the final say in the implementation of them.
I'd be really interested to see who's using it. Is anyone using GPT regularly at work? Okay, great. So that's all the people that weren't concerned in the first half.
And well, actually on that, can I throw a question out as well?
Oh, yeah.
Of those people that are using ChatGPT in work, have you discussed it with your manager, or have you had any conversations in-house about how or if you should be using it? Okay, yeah, a lot less. So it's really interesting. A lot of people are using it, but aren't declaring that they're using it.
Yeah.
They're still kind of like, are we allowed to use this? Are we not?
Yeah.
And actually, I think that being transparent about the fact, well, it's being used now and it's going to increasingly be used.
Yeah.
So we need to think about, well, what's our policy position on this?
I mean, that's one example, is people just bringing it into the office. What are some other examples of the implementation, maybe at kind of at the level of the venue rather than the specific work?
Yeah. So for me, I kind of categorize the use of AI in museums as AI that's used to improve visitor experience. So thinking about operations. So for example, the National Gallery has a predictive analytics dashboard that it's had for about 5 years now. And that essentially uses a really wide range of different data points to predict visitor attendance. And that can be used to help decide how long an exhibition should run for, or how to staff an exhibition on any given day. We're also seeing AI being used to increase sales. So thinking from a marketing perspective, whether that's generating copy or visual images, or also being used as a mechanism to better target people in a variety of online platforms. We're seeing AI being used in museums, particularly visual art museums, when it comes to artists using AI almost like their paintbrush. So they're using AI as their medium. And then the fourth category that I define is critical technology discourse. So museums that are engaging with the wider societal impact of AI through contemporary commissioning of collections, but also through public programming and providing a civic space for developing what the future of these technologies might be.
And Jamie, come to you. I mean, you're in charge of Digital Science Museum Group. What can you tell us a bit about if you have implemented any, if you want to, if there's pressure to?
I mean, at the moment, so we're using it quite a lot on our collection site behind the scenes. So we use it for things like, I mean, very simple things like photographs. So we'll take what's in the photograph and we might put that in keywords, but we will never present that to a user. So it's sometimes we'll have a picture of something that hasn't been catalogued in detail, and we can take from that picture the words, but we'll put them in the index. So you'll never see those words, but if you're coming to look for it, it'll throw it up as a thing. We use it for sort of suggestions across multiple systems, all that have people records and company records. And we'll use that as a kind of behind the scenes, as a hint for kind of, are these possibly connected? And we can flag up to our creators, say, can you check if these are the same? But we would never display that to an end user until it's been humanly verified. We connect our things up to Wikidata, again, using the same sort of process, kind of, we get the hints. So we make this distinction between, would we use it to surface information and make a best guess behind the scenes in terms of discovery? We would never present it as the computer said this is what it is, as catalogue data on the collection website. So yeah, it's useful. I mean, I think if you went to Google, it's the same thing. You're typing into Google and it'll throw up a suggestion. It doesn't mean that first Google result is the correct answer. It's up to you to make that final decision. But yeah, so that distinction between using it to categorize, help people find stuff, but not using it as a final fact.
And I think it's funny, it's a conversation we had probably 5 years ago, and I think it's still true today. There are problems with AI. There's issues around bias, there's issues around hallucinations, where essentially AI makes things up but presents it as fact. And human augmentation is one mechanism of ensuring that things that you're surfacing or serving to your users or your visitors is accurate and correct. But I remember, you probably remember this 5 years ago during the Museums and AI Network, somebody said, I can't remember who it was now, said, but museums are full of lies and falsehoods and inaccuracies. So if we're not using AI because it may not be accurate, we shouldn't be using museums, because there's a lot of value judgments that are 100 years old that are also racist and biased and sexist and mislabeled. So on that logic, if we're not using AI for those reasons, should we just close museums? And I think that's really interesting. So as much as I'm very hesitant about AI, and I don't think it's a silver bullet in the way that sometimes marketing presents it, I think being transparent about its uses, being transparent about the problems, being transparent about, well, what's our process to human augmentation? How are we using it behind the scenes to create kind of front-facing and almost unboxing AI in the same way we do curatorial? Is a really useful way forward for museums to think about AI. But I think it's also a really useful space for museums going forward in terms of contemporary relevance, that actually museums are a really great civic space for us to understand the wider impact of these technologies, whether that's on education outcomes or, you know, how scans are used in the NHS, or thinking through to the impact of fake news and democracy. In some ways, I think when we look at kind of the visual assets that are created with generative AI, it's a bit like the chaos of the 1800s white man who went and stole stuff and brought it back. And it took really about 100 years, and we're still doing that now in terms of creating taxonomies and labeling and systems and hierarchies of knowledge. Like generative AI, the junk that's being created now is a bit like all the stuff that was put on a wooden boat, you know, and I think it's going to take us some time to create taxonomies, to create hierarchies, to fully understand, to know, well, what's a good system, what's a bad system.
I think this is really, the whole, there is a question here of taxonomies, and we have Barbie dolls that are collected in our collection for multiple different reasons. They'll be collected as plastic, and when they've been collected as plastic, they'll be labelled up as plastics, and that will be the focus. And another thing, it will be about early learning, and another way it will be about gender, and they're completely separate in the collection. Someone could go through and re-tag all of those on one universal taxonomy, which probably doesn't exist across. And then there's a question, so there's a thought of kind of, can we actually show what's related? And computers are very good at saying these things are related in an amorphous way. And I wonder, it's not a replacement, but if you think about music, you say, here's one musical song and here's another one. They're similar in more amorphous ways than just rock or same producers. And to me, there's a very interesting thing of where the line on that is drawn between saying these things are similar for some reason without saying they're related, and when is that okay and when is it not? It's something we've been thinking a lot about, particularly like, here's an object on the collection site, what other things are on the collection, what else in the museum may be interested at, and can we use AI to generate those relationships? And it's something we're toying with at the moment, on when is it junk, when is it sort of dangerous to say we think it's related, and as a user, is it more useful to come to a collection page and say, here are some other things that you may find useful? So sort of facts versus leading people in the right direction.
Can you tell me a bit more about where you consider yourself to be in the implementation stage? Do you think you're ahead of the game? Are you, and what kind of conversations are you having?
I mean, I think for things, what we're finding is the technology is rapidly. Sort of 5 years ago, we were doing a research project of trying to rolling out the stuff our own. And now actually the stuff is off the shelf, and it's still in APIs and stuff, but it's increasingly getting smarter and cheaper. We're not at the level that we're going to be building our own sort of. This stuff is off the shelf to a large extent. We haven't got the funding to come build our own. We can tweak our models and slightly change them, but so I think we're going to see increasingly people using off the shelf tools and APIs rather than rolling, even at the Science Museum. I mean, maybe if you're Stanford or a huge American university, you might too. But what we're talking about really is what's out there can be used off the shelf to a large extent. That's true. I mean, most people aren't built. They're tweaking them, so it comes back to you. Sort of where are you using? What models are you using to do this stuff? But at the moment we're actually in the middle of a project looking at how we can build relationships between our collection site and our other articles on the rest of the website at scale. To say there might be an article in the journal that might be related to this thing, which we can't do at scale. That's just, I mean, there is a question at scale. There's a million objects, and we can't go through a million objects and do it. So there's can we surface them and put in a box saying, you may like this, this may be useful to you. Can we track that and find out which of those were useful to people?
Yeah.
Can we use that? So that's a lot where I think
has it surprised you at any point? Is it?
I mean, sometimes, yeah, and so this is, in a way, if we do it, it's got to be in a box saying this is a sort of beta feature, because sometimes it is hallucinating. You have no idea why it's connected two things together.
Yeah.
Well, it's just, well, sometimes you do it quite playfully. It's quite fun because you can sort of say, and so sometimes there's a surprising thing of like, why has it made that? But I think it's how you're presenting it in a website. Once it starts to become a fact, then it's sort of, it's annoying. If it's you may like this, here's a fun new feature, then it's possibly more acceptable.
Oonagh, can you help me kind of paint a picture of what the future looks like? Because this technology seems to have very quickly come out of nowhere, was quite rubbish for a year and didn't make any sense. And then suddenly everyone's using it in their office. Is it just going to keep getting better? Is that what happens? Or do you think we're at a point now where it kind of plateaus and becomes a bit more detail orientated?
Yeah, so I think it goes two ways. I think, yes, in terms of operational usage, it'll become the norm. Like, I think AI is, I was going to say it's it's embedded within, but it's in Word, it's in Excel, it's already in the tools that you use every day that we're familiar with. That's that's going to increase. I don't see that. Yeah, I think that's just going to get better. In terms of wider applications, I honestly don't know. I think it's a really interesting time, and I think in the UK context, potentially new government coming in. We're really only a few years into thinking about AI from a legislative and policy context. And, if we look at like the online safety bill, the implementation of these policies, I think, are going to really shape how public sector organizations use AI going forward. There are increasing questions and concerns around mental health, around young people, around digital. We've kind of been in the Wild West.
Yeah.
And I do think that over the next 10 years, there will be a move towards more evidence-based policymaking and legislation, which will also have an impact on public sector organizations. What that looks like, I think, will in some ways depend on who is in power in the UK, but also in the US.
Yeah. So great thought to think about. Let's not dwell on it for too long. Jamie, I just wanted to go to you for a second. Thinking about, you've mentioned funding. If were funding not an issue, how would you be approaching AI? Would it be in everything? Would you be trying everything? Or like the potential policy making, is there some concern to be had before diving in?
I mean, starting backwards, I suppose in some ways, there's to me, there's a sort of difference between doing sort of fun things and another thing of saying using an AI to decide what you should dispose of in your collection. I'm taking absolute extremes there, but there's some decisions where the outcome has got a real potential risk.
Because it would have an answer if you asked it what to dispose of.
Yeah, and it could well be wrong, and you don't know why it's decided it. So, if it's sort of, so I think it comes back to thinking: is there a human thing that's really is? And there's a risk, isn't there? With all, I mean, it's outside of the museum sector there. That kind of, are you relying on to say who is bad in an airport, or are you, and there's you over the time there's a risk of people just getting used to it and relying on it. I suppose in funding that there is. I think really go back to it, it's so wide in what you're doing, but and there's a lot of off-the-shelf stuff now, and so some of it feels harmless. And I wouldn't, in some ways, as a small, I wouldn't start a big project trying to build your own data models. And it's basically saying what is off. It's so rapid that really trying to be ahead of the curve technology-wise is risky. So it's really what's there, mature is a hard word in AI because it's changing monthly. But yeah, you looking what's there. And within our industry, we're not probably no one in our industry is going to be building giant sort of AI technology systems. We're going to be leveraging what is out there. So there's a question of
well, that's interesting. That brings me to another question about if there's a bit of an arms race, because you've mentioned the tech bros, and there certainly is an arms race between them. And I think ethics be damned for a lot of the time. If those are the products that end up off the shelf, is that a worry? Is that a concern? Does that feel like something that could happen?
I guess it depends on your institution and why you exist.
Yeah.
You know, if you're an organization that focuses on children and young people, you probably want to ask questions around, you know, what are the guardrails, what are the protections for children and young people and children and young people's rights on that platform. You know, if you're a commercial art gallery that's focused on profit, you probably care about that less, and that's fine. So I think a lot of this is really about mission and purpose. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about asking, you know, the same questions that you would ask of any project that you were developing. And those kind of grounding principles and questions that you ask of any new project or any funding application are the questions you should ask of AI.
Right.
And, you know, if a service provider is trying to, you know, sell you a platform, whatever it's for, if they can't explain it to you in layman's terms, in terms of how it works, then don't buy it.
Okay.
You know, if somebody's selling you something that's magic, well, it's probably not magic and they probably don't know what they're selling you. So, you know, if they can't, you know, I think that's one of the things that I'm not technical, and my interest is very much in strategy and implementation. So I speak to people like Jamie and I go, but how? I don't understand. And I'm quite confident at being the least technical person in the room. And I see my job as being a translator between people like Jamie and people who have heard about AI for the first time today. If somebody makes you feel like you're stupid in this space, then they're not very good at their job. Because if they can't explain the technology, then they shouldn't be working with it. So don't be afraid to ask questions and keep asking questions. And yeah, if there isn't an answer, then I would be dubious about using that service provider.
Right.
I think on that, something's just jumped to my head. So, one of the things, I hope no one here is actually going to sell one, but we keep seeing people come to us and saying, actually, for your images on your website, you can get an AI to write the captions, and they're useless. They're good in 80% of the time. 50% of the time, they're absolutely stunningly amazing. And so when someone comes and do a sales pitch and they'll show you the 50%, it's mind blowing. You're like, oh my God, I can just save so much time using that. But you can't let that loose. And so I think there's an awareness of these sort of silver bullets.
Yeah. If it looks too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true.
So yeah, I think that's so those things that kind of, we can write museum guides, and what it will do was write, AI is on ChatGPT, write what you expect to hear very convincingly, if I'm summing it.
Yeah.
So what you'll get is something that sounds like it should be a museum description guide. Doesn't mean it's going to be any good. And it becomes repetitive. I'm sure everyone's played with ChatGPT knows it writes in a particular style. And so it's very good at wowing you. So, but yeah, ask the questions about the longer things, take the hard examples and go, but what about guides for these things? It's good at the broad things that are very common, or even come back to the captions. It's sort of, yeah.
And I think, like, in terms of kind of solutionism, you know, I think my go-to example for this, and you can still find it, it's up on the internet, Newsnight about 3 years ago, the brilliant expose on Manchester Arena. So Manchester Arena had the terrible bombing, and the conclusion was that staff weren't properly trained and they weren't in the positions they were meant to be. So I'm sure there's lots of operations people here today. That's a genuine fear and concern, security in your museum. So the problem was people, the solution was AI. And they were sold an AI scanning platform, kind of airport style gates, that promised, I'm making these numbers up, but go and look at the Newsnight. If you type in Manchester Arena, Newsnight, security AI, you'll find it. It promised something like 99.9% accuracy. It could detect every single bomb, every single weapon, everything that had never even been made. People were yet to make it on their kitchen table. These security scanners could detect it. and they had all this academic research supporting it. They had all these shiny videos, and Newsnight went and independently tested it, because a whistleblower from in the organization said, this is all like data editing. Like, they've taken all of these academic references out of context. And really what they found was it was useless. Like, it detected some things, but not as much as a human would have. And I think that it's about 10 minutes long. It's a really, really good explainer. And that was very much a supplier selling something to somebody that didn't understand the technology. So they went, we've got a problem. The supplier went, we've got a solution. And they went, great. Humans are useless. They've got the answer. Let's use it. And so, yeah, I think that it's only about 10 minutes long. But I think if you're thinking about partnering with a supplier and it's maybe the first time that you're buying something from AI, I think even if it's not security or operations, I think that documentary would really help you to develop your critical thinking and your questioning skills to think about what are the questions we need to be asking.
And on that, do you think it's not too soon then, do you think, for any organization to take that intervention for maybe people are using AI and that creep of the technology coming in at the employee level? So even if you've not partnered with any AI company, that people just need to save time because everyone's so busy and stretched, and they've got to write this thing, and we've only got 5 minutes and ChatGPT will do it. Is it time to send an email around going, can you please not do this or do that, or check with us before you paste this Excel sheet into somewhere?
Yeah. To be honest, like, within a year, I don't even think this will be a question because we'll just be using it.
Right.
But I just think it's about transparency. You know, if you've used it in a report, say you've used it, have an open conversation in your team and say, hey, so like, I'm using this. Is anyone else using this? Like, what do we think? So I think it's, like, people are hiding it because they don't really know if they're allowed to use it or not.
Yeah.
And I think it's just about empowering people to say, what are people playing with? What are people using?
I think at the moment it's still you can still tell the difference as well, and it's soon maybe not. And I've just put recruited for a role, and I would say almost every single CV was written by ChatGPT of different levels. I mean, some you're like, that's probably gone from ChatGPT and you've rewritten it really. I mean, some I couldn't tell, but yeah, at the bottom 20%, you were like, that is literally a cut and paste job, and it reads like ChatGPT, and you're like, yeah. So I suppose it just goes. What was it? That there's a sort of there's a critical thinking there. Like,
yeah. Well, then you need an AI to go through all the applications and
that's the other. I mean, I suppose we did joke about that. Actually, is it better to get your AI to write you the thing if the AIs are reading the candidates? But as a human reader, you're like, I know how that was written.
Yeah.
It follows a formula.
I mean, we've talked a lot today about, obviously, AI is nothing without data, and museums they hold a lot of data. There's also the visitor experience angle as well. We've got an exhibitor here today who I've already been up to, and it's a photo booth that turned me into a Prince of Persia, maybe something like that. I didn't get much of a choice over it, to be honest. But what about in that space? Do you think it feels a lot more like that's a space where, especially if you're upfront about it, there's not the same issues, especially creative visitor experience based things? This is the time to you can be a bit less cautious maybe and just introduce it.
Yeah, so I think again, it comes down to transparency. We're already seeing these technologies being used, in airports, when you go and do your scanning at Tesco because they've fired all their staff, they're scanning your face to see if you're a shoplifter. There's kind of mission creep to these technologies in society already. I do think museums should aspire to having, like a higher bar as public service institutions. They're not for profit, they're not commercial. But, having a higher ethical bar requires time and money. And it's about finding that balance, I think.
Yeah. And just, I guess, before we wrap up, I just want to have a look at what you both think the longer term future might look like, because there is, and it's maybe outdated now, this idea that AI is going to take everyone's jobs. It doesn't seem to have happened. And as you've mentioned, anytime AI is being implemented, you're absolutely going to need someone to check it anyway. So can you paint a picture of how you think things might go? Is this, are we looking at a future where it's, again, a kind of unimaginable increase in capacity, or is it going to look a lot more like it does at the moment? Do you want to go first?
Let you go first.
I'm coming from a collections point of view, but I think in some ways it's great at surfacing stuff. So if you've got huge archives that you were never going to be able to go through, then the positive is you can go through that thing, you can pull out keywords, you can you can make sense of something that sort of effectively serves us. So it's the equivalent of having a huge number of basic researchers to bring it up. And so that may be better in the long term, that stuff becomes visible. The top stuff still will need humans. So, and I think, so getting good at sort of surfacing stuff that may have been hidden in the past. And that's my positive take from it.
What about you?
Yeah, so I think that the emerging skill set that I think is going to really rise and become a distinct job role in itself, but I think actually more likely be embedded in the existing job roles, is prompt engineering. And prompt engineering is essentially, again, I'm not technical, you might disagree with this, I'm going to say it's layman's coding. So rather than having to type, coding like you see on the TV and the films, instead you're using words to describe what you want the system to do. Is that an acceptable description?
I would agree. That's a thing I think we'll see. I think if you look back in the past, there was role, even in computers, at one point you wrote code in noughts and ones on a binary system, and then languages have become more abstract. So now you can sort of learn basic coding in a sort of thing. And now you actually can start writing coding in English. And I've met people who taught themselves coding by typing prompts and watching what comes back from ChatGPT. And I think that's going to evolve very, very rapidly, so that people's ability to build systems to do stuff won't be the domain purely of programs anymore. Programs will have a role within that in a different capacity, but a bit like if you're a designer, you're not necessarily a typesetter. You might know how to use Photoshop. And I think the same probably is true in design, actually, that there's a time you could tell an AI what you wanted to design, and it'll come up with something that will then tweak. So it's,
And the skill will be knowing what they ask it. So I can ask an AI to design something for me, but I'm not a designer. If a designer asks an AI to design something for it, they're going to have a different language.
Absolutely.
And their outcome is going to be better than mine.
Yeah.
But so I think increasingly, but I would say within 10 years, every single job will have a requirement in terms of prompt engineering skills. So whether you're operations, curator, front of house, I think that will be a skill.
Oh, really? Even in front of house, even?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And I suppose you could go back to even like a calculator. There was a point that once you need to know maths if you were working in almost any career, and now you can rely on a calculator. That's a very simple change, but it hasn't radically changed. It has put some jobs out of practice, but it hasn't radically changed. It's just meant people freed themselves up from having to sit there and do complex calculus or so that's, if you think of that as a step change, I imagine there's a similar step change in prompt engineering.
And I think to do a sales pitch for myself and Jamie's work, which is quite old now, but still holds up pretty well. If you search for the Museums and AI Network, you'll come across the Museums AI Toolkit. And we originally published it in English, and it includes a bunch of use cases and 2-pagers. Our pitch level was a museum director whose museum director friend has doing an AI project, so they want one too.
Right.
And we wrote it so that you could give it to your museum director and say, go and read that, and then come back to me again and tell me what you actually want to do. So there's a bunch of use cases in it. There's a glossary, but there's also a series of workflow formats. So there's a AI capabilities framework, there's an AI ethics framework, and the stakeholder map. And essentially, all 3 of those workflow models are a list of questions. So whether you're developing something in-house or you're working with an external supplier, I'd really encourage you to look at that Museums and AI toolkit, because I think the question flow is a really good way to kind of embed some kind of ethical rigor into the project that you're working on. So we first published that probably 5 years ago now. 4 or 5 years ago, and it's now being published in Italian, German, Spanish, and we're currently working on the Chinese version. And each of them has a different set of case studies local to the region.
Right.
So the frameworks translate because they're essentially prompts and questions. But one of the things I was really keen on, we were approached by external partners, was AI is, in the context we're working, it's a social cultural data set. So actually the context in which you're working really matters. So, Spain and Germany wanted to use our use case from the National Gallery, which is a brilliant use case, but actually embedding local knowledge, local skills, local worldviews is really important.
Yeah.
So it's quite a big resource now. I think we probably have about maybe 15 use cases up. So I'd really encourage you to go and look at that resource as well.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a couple of minutes for some questions, if that's all right. A couple of questions from the audience. Any questions for the panel?
Would you like to put your hand up? Any?
Wow, okay.
Oh, there's one
Okay.
over there.
Do you mind passing?
Hi. Jamie, on a couple of occasions you mentioned getting a surprising answer and not knowing why the AI system had done it. Now, I vaguely remember the idea of such systems actually, as it were, presenting you with their working. Now, is that a thing or is it not?
I think it's probably a not. I think now it has just got too complex to know how it's got from that to the answer without going to which is that's true. I mean, it's without getting into the complexities, and the answer pops out if I'm and yeah, it's very hard actually to work out why. I mean, you can look at a pattern and say it's an early image recognition. It recognised everything that was thin as a spear, and we've sort of joked that it was like obsessed with sort of spears and weapons. So you're like, okay, I can see what an image recognition is doing there. It's recognising thin objects as a spear, but more generally, no, it's really difficult.
Okay. And another thought, we've put a lot of energy into developing sort of structured information frameworks for museums. Have you attempted to actually feed those into an AI system and see what it can do with them?
Yeah, we have. You can use them to sort of almost bootstrap. So if you know that information, and if you're trying to build a classifier and saying, does this person, say Charles Babbage, which Charles Babbage is he? If you're already feeding those informations along with everything else you know, you'll also get much better results. So you can use it in that way. That curatorial metadata will get you much better results in terms of sort of matching and clustering. And you should feed those in when you're using it. You can also use it to bootstrap and train a model slightly. So if you want to, technically, but if you want to adjust an off-the-shelf model, you can use the stuff you know to improve the model. So there is value in that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Absolutely.
Hi, that was really interesting. Thank you. My question was actually going to be about search and the future of that and how AI is going to change the future of search and how museums can get ahead and what we can do.
So I think, there's probably not much you can do tomorrow where the future of search will a technology called vectors or embeddings, and it's this notion that traditionally you would have taken all the words on a page and you would have built a big index out of those words, and now what we'll do is take all of those words and their relationships to the words on the page and the other things, and you get this big number back called a vector, which is, if you think of it as a big three-dimensional space. And so this article here will have a number in a think of it X, Y, and Z, but it's in 1,000 dimensions, and another thing here, and you'll match that these things are close together. And that's when you type into Google, you actually now doesn't take your words and find you things that got similar words. It takes your question and turns it into a big pinpoint in sort of this virtual space and says what other things are in that space. And that's the big shift really, is from indexed text to vector searching. I think that's going to be, which will mean you can find you could relate two things. You can search something where the words you type in don't have to appear in the thing you're searching for. So that's really probably the easiest way to think about it. I can ask a question and have none of those words appear in the thing I'm searching for, but it will match it up. So that's, in terms of information retrieval, that's the big step change. And we'll see a lot of that.
Okay, are there any more questions at all before we finish? No. So if I can just ask you to thank Jamie, Oonagh and Alistair again, a really interesting presentation. Thank you.